Okay, continuing on from where we left off in part three, had got into sectionalism, what it was or is, and several things, three things that pushed it along around the years 18, 19, and 20. Okay, as it sort of became a countertrend from nationalism. Don't get me wrong, we didn't really stop being nationalistic until maybe the Civil War era. It's just that we got two things going on at once, as if before any of this came along, before even nationalism came along, we say, I'm a Virginian. That's your primary identification. Nationalism comes along, and I'm an American. Sectionalism comes along, well, I'm an American, but I'm a Southerner, or as the case might be, a Northerner, a Westerner. Okay. One more thing on the factor we dealt with last time, which was the emergence of the West as a distinct section with its own interests, which are often and some can be in conflict with those of the North and the South, and to some extent its own unique culture. They really needed federal funding for their roads and bridges, which they referred to together as internal improvements. Now, there was an argument against this. President Monroe, who was in office when this first came up, President Monroe took the position that federal funding for such things would be unconstitutional unless they were interstate. Okay, the federal government could not build a road that was entirely in one state, or a bridge. If it built a bridge, it better have one end in one state and the other end in the other. Now, there was one big project. Now, today we have interstate highways. I guess this would have been an early example of that. It came to be called the Cumberland Road. It extended from Cumberland, Maryland to Vandalia, Illinois, and it took 41 years to build it. Typical federal project. They started it in 1811 and finished it in 1852, if I'm correctly informed. Yeah, you could do that. And there were already a number of lighthouses. There's a lighthouse on the far southeastern coast of Virginia, and there are two of them, almost side by side. One of them is the first building ever built by the federal government. It's built in 1790 or so. It's no longer in use. Nearby is the new lighthouse, which they built in 1883. Of course, that's not interstate. All right. The next of the three things that promoted or pushed sectionalism along was the fact, you know what? I already did that. The economy rolling off the table. I thought, where did I leave off last time? All right, right there. The Panic of 1819. I didn't get maybe quite through with it. I'll review it quickly. We had a severe economic downturn in 1819, referred to as the Panic of 1819. They called it that because when this thing starts to happen, and they tend to be swift and brutal, people would literally panic. For one thing, bank deposits aren't insured, and if a bank closes with your money in it, your money is gone. So, the people would stampede to banks or whatever it was, and trying to get their deposits out, or whatever kind of business it was. Now, that's the first of 5 panics that we had in the 19th century, each of them starting a lengthy economic downturn that would much later be referred to as a depression. At the time, they just called them panics for the conditions in which they'd start. And it's a primitive version of a depression, starting in 1819. The last one in that century wasn't until 1896, and it had a lot of the same earmarks as the Great Depression some years later. We had panics, and you don't need to remember this right now: 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, and 1893. And this appears to have got the point across to a large number of people, maybe for the first time, that the policies of the federal government actually mattered. Apparently, people had thought of the federal government as being sort of distant and remote and not really doing anything you need to pay attention to. But when the economy turns down, people want the government to stabilize the economy. And the lesson that was learned, as I said last time, was that there wasn't any one thing the federal government could do that would help everybody. Almost anything it could do would help some by hurting others. And you know what? That is still true. I can really only think of maybe one thing in terms of economics that has been uniformly beneficial. So just people have these high hopes of how it's childlike faith, really. Maybe we should pat them on the head and say they're there. They actually believe that the government has the power to make things better. That's a subject for another day. But the West wants a easier land policy. The eastern sections oppose that because that will stagnate their economies. The South and the West want the tariff lowered to reduce the price of manufactured goods. The Northeast wants the tariff raised to protect them from foreign competition, and on like that. It's always something. Okay, the third of these crises had to do with, I'm going to call it the Missouri Controversy, leading eventually to the Missouri Compromise. Missouri was a territory. And let me start this by advising you that about some terms we're going to use. Okay, there were slave states and there were free states. A state where slavery was legal is referred to as a slave state. If it's not legal, it's a free state. Now, there's some gray area here. Some of the northern states, in fact, all 13 colonies had allowed slavery, some on a much larger scale than others. New York State, the last legally held slave in New York State did not die until the mid-1840s, but it was practiced on a very small scale. Anyway, from about the turn of the century, when there were 16 states, they were balanced, 8 free and 8 slave, and Congress then just tacitly, meaning I don't think they talked about it, took up a custom of whenever they admitted a free state, they would admit a slave state. Not on the same day, but within a fairly tight time frame. That preserves a balance in the Senate between slave states and free states, and it's very important primarily to the slave states because they're never really quite getting a good night's sleep lest the free states gang up on them and outlaw slavery. So that's just the way things are done. Now, in 1819, I believe it's 18, it doesn't even matter, right there somewhere, the territory of Missouri sought admission to the Union as a state, as a slave state. Okay? The way this worked, starting with the land ordinance with the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, Congress could create territories, which would be in 3 phases. Until it reached a certain population threshold, it would be unorganized, meaning you'd have a governor and a handful of judges. And that'd be the government. And that's when a whole territory might not have any more people than, say, Parker County does. Then, once it passes the first population threshold, it becomes an organized territory where the people can elect a territorial legislature with lawmaking power. The governor would still be appointed by the national government. Now, when the time came when another population threshold has been met, the territory could initiate the process of petitioning for admission as a state. Then Congress, if Congress agrees, the territory, which is trying to become a state, would call a constitutional convention and would write a proposed state constitution, submit that to the voters. If it passes, then that constitution itself is sent to Congress as an application for statehood. If Congress finds no objection, they pass a joint resolution, simple majority in both houses, known as an act of admission, and voila, the territory becomes a state on a fully equal footing. Okay, that's where Missouri was. Problem is, Missouri is a slave state, and there aren't any potential free states lined up ready to keep the balance in the Senate. So it becomes controversial. If Missouri is admitted as a slave state, that would give the slave states an advantage in the Senate over the free states for who knew how long, and what use might be made of it. So things got real hot real quick. And a northern congressman named Talmadge with two L's, added an amendment to the Act of Admission called the Talmadge Amendment. What it would have done, had it become law, which it did not, it would have admitted Missouri as a slave state with conditions. And the conditions were that from the day it became a state, no more slaves could legally be taken into Missouri. Plus, any slaves already there who were not yet 25 years old on the date of admission would be set free upon reaching the age of 25. So it would morph Missouri into a free state. This closely resembled the process that New York State was imposing upon itself to morph into an entirely free state. So this became bitter and angry. Members of Congress are showing up armed. They got Bowie knives in their boots, and they got derringers in their pockets if they had those yet. They're ready to fight. Cane swords didn't come to that, but it was close. There was talk of breaking up the Union that early. This is in 1820. All right. How did it get settled? The Missouri Compromise was the work of Kentucky Congressman Henry Clay, who would go on to do this time and again, riding to the rescue with acceptable compromises that would band-aid the Union for another few years and keep it together, with the slavery issue always hovering dangerously in the background. Terms of the Missouri Compromise. Missouri would be admitted to the Union as a slave state with no conditions, no restrictions on slavery. The Talmadge Amendment would not become law. To preserve the balance, this is going to sound crazy, Massachusetts was divided into two states. Okay? You see, back in colonial times, in fact, in 1679, the Massachusetts Bay Company, which technically was still the government of that colony, had bought out the claims of a number of heirs of the original stockholders of the old Plymouth Company, which had failed to establish a settlement the same year the London Company succeeded at Jamestown. So that added this whole area, poorly defined at the north end, called the District of Maine. And the people there wanted to be a separate state. Massachusetts didn't mind, so that part of Massachusetts was split off and admitted to the Union in 1820 as the state of Maine. That's where Maine came from. And that preserved the balance. Furthermore, it was agreed that no more slave states could be created north of the southern boundary of Missouri, which was referred to by the geographical coordinates 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude. Now, this did not include this boot heel hanging off the southeastern corner of Missouri, if you know what that state looks like. Story on that is there was a large landowner in that area who was south of the line, and he did not want to be in the state of Arkansas. So he piled up as much cash as he could get his hands on, journeyed to Washington, D.C., and bribed as many congressmen as he could bribe to get his area added to Missouri instead of left as part of Arkansas. So sectionalism was very much alive and well after all that. So after this, we're going to move on to the rise of the new democracy. I'm going to have to do a bunch of 1302 videos before I get back to it. But I'm hoping to get back to that by later today.